Before the scientific revolution, facts about the universe, medicine, and even the human body were basically bogus, which meant 16th century brainiacs had some convincing to do. Here's a look at the twisted history of the scientific revolution. When Jakob Karl von Gaweiler married his second wife while he was already married to his first, then attempted to murder one of those angry wives with a knife, he probably assumed his memory was cursed. He was beheaded for his crimes on May 12, 1543. At the time, Andreas Vesalius, a Swiss atomist, was figuring out how the human body actually worked, and he needed an actual body to study. Conveniently for Vesalius, von Gaweiler's corpse was gifted to him by the town of Basel, and with that body, Vesalius made the first ever public anatomy demonstration. He cut open the corpse to showcase how the human body was put together before boiling the cartilage from the bone and preparing the bones for viewing. In fact, the Anatomical Museum of the University of Basel still has von Gaweiler's skeleton, as prepared by Vesalius, on display nearly 500 years later, and it looks just as good as it did in the 16th century. The thing about science and figuring out the workings of the world via empirical evidence is that it has the potential to upset the powers that be. For instance, at the time of the scientific revolution, the prevailing authority in Europe was the Catholic Church, which until then had enjoyed a long stretch of unchallenged power. Everything they said was law, everything they ruled was God's will, and according to the Church, they were the only humans God would deign to speak to.
This is an ecclesiastical court. You are here by my consent.
The Church wasn't a big fan of science, particularly when it contradicted Christian doctrine. Take, for instance, the very unfortunate Giordano Bruno. Among Bruno's ideas was a philosophical belief that the universe was endless and that there were solar systems out there other than our own. Bruno's first brush with the law came when he outlined every mistake one of his professors made in a lecture. This was considered slander, an offense that landed Bruno in prison. It was just the first in a string of outspoken beliefs that finally ended with him being bound, gagged, stripped naked, and burned at the stake. However, in 2000, the Catholic Church admitted that it regretted Bruno's fiery execution, whatever that's worth. There were scores of intellects at work during the scientific revolution, and they had specialties. For Dutch physician René de Graaf, that specialty was the female reproductive system, although he occasionally dabbled in testicles as well. De Graaf pioneered our understanding of the reproductive organs in an environment rife with not-so-healthy competition. De Graaf's rival came in the form of a schoolmate named Jan Swammerdam. In 1672, when de Graaf published On the Service of the Generation of Women's Organs, about all things ovaries and their importance to the female reproductive system, Swammerdam was outraged. He believed he and his colleague Johannes van Hoorn had made that discovery first. The spat got heated, and not long after, at just 32 years old, de Graaf passed away. Between the professional conflict and the death of his son, it's believed that the stress was too much and had a significant role in his untimely death. Microbiology is a big deal. The Microbiology Society states on its website that microorganisms matter because they affect every aspect of our lives. They are in us, on us, and around us. Microbes impact everything that happens on Earth at every moment. They're everywhere, always, and few things are more significant to the world's living inhabitants, despite how tiny microbes are. So it might come as a surprise that the study of microbiology began as an accident. It began like no other scientific breakthrough ever, with a fabric seller, Antony van Leeuwenhoek. Van Leeuwenhoek was using the most powerful microscope of the time to observe local algae when he saw a tiny creature bolt across the lens. He figured the creature to be 10,000 times smaller than a mite. Van Leeuwenhoek began using his microscope on everything he could find, including his own skin and mouth, and made a discovery that we now take for granted. Microbes are everywhere. While he wouldn't live to see the impact of his discovery, it led to probably the most important breakthrough in the history of medicine, germ theory, which postulates that some illnesses are caused by the unwelcome presence of microbes. In 1669, in Hamburg, Germany, a merchant by the name of Henning Brandt decided to set up a little experiment for himself. He took some urine, maybe his own, maybe not, fermented it, and after distilling the boiled reduction, came out with a remarkable substance. It was what we know today as phosphorus, and it had two impressive properties. It can spontaneously combust, and it glows in the dark.
Beautiful and I think terrifying at the same time.
That's some premium entertainment for the 17th century. Soon after its discovery, attempts were made to find some kind of medicinal use for the stuff. The thinking was that something that glowed and spontaneously combusted must be quite powerful, and they were not wrong.
He didn't know it was an element. In fact, he had no idea what an element was. He called it cold fire.
Brandt continued testing the substance, but he also began to sell his isolated discovery to other chemists, including Isaac Newton, who created his own recipe for the creation of this same isolated variant, which started with 1 barrel of urine. The uses of phosphorus continued to evolve and transform over the years, with its glowing residue a continual fascination to chemists. And then in 1943, it was Brandt's beloved phosphorus that would come raining back down on his city of Hamburg. Living up to its prophesied power for all the wrong reasons, phosphorus bombs burned the entire city and are still being used as weapons of war today, although human rights groups object to its use. Most people have heard of Isaac Newton. He's a guy who saw the apple fall and came up with the concept of gravity. Whether or not the legend of the apple is true, Newton was a leading mind during the latter stages of the scientific revolution. He was one of those rare minds that was revered while he was still alive, recognized as being wildly ahead of the game, up there with Einstein and Darwin as one of the most important thinkers of all time. Great minds have to push boundaries, of course, but one boundary that Newton pushed only recently came to light. When he died, he left behind so many papers and manuscripts that the word count is estimated to be around 10 million. Stuck amid these papers is evidence that, along with science, the great Newton may have also dabbled in some stuff the church would not approve of, the occult. Indeed, by the standards of the day, Isaac Newton was a heretic and may have faced punishment had the church caught wind of his ideas about religion. For example, Newton completely rejected the idea of the Holy Trinity. He saw Jesus as a sort of middleman who helped connect humanity with God. Off with his formerly revered scientific head. Galileo Galilei was a man whose name and reputation are pretty well established both in our day and in his own. However, Galileo backed what was at the time a very controversial idea, that the Earth revolved around the sun.
This discovery was revolutionary because it really proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Earth is not the center of the universe.
This idea had previously been proposed by several astronomers, most notably Nicholas Copernicus in 1543, and Galileo twice spoke up to essentially denounce the church's insistence that it was the opposite. According to the capital C Church, Scripture explicitly states that the Earth is the center of the universe, and to say anything otherwise was quite literally heresy.
What about the moon? For one thing, it doesn't give off any light of its own.
This was unfortunate for Galileo, who soon found himself subjected to the scrutiny of Chief Inquisitor Father Vincenzo Machiellani da Firenzuola. At his trial, which was somewhat stacked against him, the church ruled that Galileo was guilty of heresy and condemned him to prison, quote, at their pleasure. With torture as the only other option, Galileo agreed not to share his heretical insanity about the sun being the center of the solar system and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. In case you're wondering, the church did eventually admit that Galileo was right and cleared him of the charge in 1992. Perhaps the word homunculus doesn't carry negative connotations for people unfamiliar with the anime series Full Metal Alchemist, but the word in Latin means little man and is defined as an artificially made dwarf supposedly produced in a flask by an alchemist. Stop right there and it's still terrifying, but there's more. The prospect of creating artificial life has always held hands with scientific advancements, even to this day. So it shouldn't be surprising that back in the scientific revolution, when practically everything was becoming more and more possible, the creation of an artificial human being was at the forefront of some pretty great minds. While the concept of artificial life goes back centuries before the onset of the scientific revolution, the experiments to get there really ramped up during the 16th century heyday of scientific progress. It was the Swiss mastermind Paracelsus, famous for bringing chemistry and medicine into the same wheelhouse, among other things, who developed an actual recipe for the creation of said homunculus. And be warned, it's not pleasant. According to him, the semen of a man should putrefy within a horse for 40 days, and then a little man would be ready. Ready for what, you may ask? According to Paracelsus, to be educated with care and not to be used for magic under any circumstances. Perhaps Paracelsus meant all of this symbolically, and again, perhaps not. Sir Francis Bacon is right up there among the big names associated with the scientific revolution. He was a philosopher as well as a scientist, but he's also known for his concept of New Atlantis, a utopian society that would be the ideal outcome for the new scientifically guided world.
400 years ago, Bacon, like many of his contemporaries, believed that Atlantis was America itself.
Bacon's Utopia was built on the premise of science being at the forefront of society rather than politics. That doesn't sound half bad. Unfortunately, Bacon's grand ideas end there. He had a lot of great notions, but not a lot of planning. There's also the matter of his scientific utopian vision being so confined by the concerns of the metaphysical. In an era where so many great minds were challenging the church and sometimes being killed for it, Bacon's idea of advancement was hampered by how much spirituality was woven into the fabric of his utopia. The scientific revolution was something of a race of competing ideas. Just as is often the case today, scientists were eager to get their discoveries out there before someone else scooped them, especially if that person was from another country. National pride and personal legacy were very much at stake, so it wasn't all that uncommon to see rivalries develop between two or more great minds and great nations. Look at François Viète, for instance. He was a mathematician and attorney from Paris who was quite popular among the French nobility. He had a close relationship with various members of the elites of France and served as an advisor to more than a few. You might even think of him as France's national math champion, the one they called on when mathematical dignity was at stake. And it was most certainly at stake when Adrian van Roman, a Dutch mathematician of some renown, posed a mathematical problem that had yet to be solved. He challenged mathematicians the world over, well, Europe over, and the Dutch ambassador himself slammed France, saying that there wasn't a real mathematician in their whole nation. Rising to the occasion, it was Viète, very much a French mathematician, who solved the equation first. Once that particular math race was over, Van Roman was so impressed that he took himself a vacation to Paris to spend more time with Viète.